Hello guys, I hope you had a wonderful day. The story today is a story of love, betrayal, and passion. It's crazy, but that is exactly what we're getting into today. But before we step into the Leakin King's territory, do me a huge favor, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed with notifications on. It helps our pack grow and ensure you never miss a new release. I want this comment section to be buzzing today. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? And while you're listening, timestamp your favorite parts. If a scene makes you laugh or swoon, let me know right when it happens. Are you ready? Let's get into the story. The arrow came from the north. It passed through the throat of the royal guard to Yora's left, and before the man hit the ground, the Alpha King had already moved, not toward safety, not toward his remaining guards, not toward the panicked pack wolves scrambling for cover in every direction. He moved toward Jane. 300 wolves watched the most powerful man in the 7 territories throw himself across an open courtyard, take a knife meant for someone else clean across the forearm without flinching, and plant himself in front of a girl who was still holding a wooden ladle and had medicinal herbs in her hair. The attacking wolves stopped. Even they hadn't expected that. The silence that followed was the specific kind of silence that occurs when an entire battlefield collectively realizes it has severely miscalculated. Yora stood over Jane with silver eyes fully shifted, not half-turned, not the polite flicker of dominance he used in political meetings, but entirely gone to wolf. His blood dripped on the courtyard stones. He didn't look at his wound. He didn't look at his guards. He didn't look at the assembled archers on the eastern wall, or the 2 rival pack alphas who had just declared war on the throne. He looked only at Jane. And Jane, Omega Jane, rejected Jane, leave already Jane, looked up at him from behind the shield of his body and said the only thing her brain, loyal to its own terrible instincts, could manage. You're bleeding on my herbs. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to the beginning. To the Tuesday everything broke. To the ceramic pot and the spilled broth and the moment the most powerful wolf alive looked at the most dismissed girl in Ironvale and his wolf, ancient and sovereign and famously impossible to impress, went absolutely still. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Kept Trying to Leave. Jane Mercer's plan for leaving Ironvale was not elaborate, but it was thorough. She had written it in the margin of her herb-drying journal, the only book she owned that nobody ever touched, because it smelled aggressively of dried nettle and disappointment. The plan had 4 steps. Step 1, pack light. Step 2, leave before sunrise. Step 3, take the Shepherd's Road east, not the main gate where Pack Elder Cromwell sat every morning eating his breakfast with the specific energy of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. Step 4, do not look back, because looking back was the emotional equivalent of stepping on your own escape rope. It was a good plan. It was a solid plan. She didn't execute it on the first morning because the Alpha King's procession arrived at dawn and blocked every exit road with ceremonial banners. She didn't execute it on the second morning because Pack Alpha Holt, visibly sweating through his formal uniform, ordered all Omegas to remain on kitchen duty until the royal visit concluded. She didn't execute it on the third morning because that was the morning a royal guard found her on the Shepherd's Road and requested, very politely, with visible existential distress, that she perhaps stay. Perhaps stay. Jane had stood on that road for a full 30 seconds staring at the guard, who stared back with the expression of a man who had not signed up for this particular assignment and was privately composing a resignation letter in his head. Why, Jane said. The king, the guard began. The king doesn't know I exist, Jane said. The guard's expression communicated, with exhausting clarity, that this was precisely the problem. She went back. Not because the guard asked. Not because she was afraid. She went back because in 6 years of being promised to Derek Vance and 4 years of failing designation trials and 22 years of being told she was the least significant wolf in a pack of 300, Jane Mercer had developed an extremely refined sense of when the universe was trying to tell her something. And standing on that road at dawn with a royal guard blocking the way and the distinct impression of silver eyes watching from the treeline felt less like a coincidence and more like a sentence. She simply didn't know yet what she was being sentenced to. Derek found her that afternoon. This was not a welcome development. Derek had a talent for finding Jane in her worst moments, not because he was perceptive, but because he was the sort of person whose timing was catastrophically good for himself and catastrophically bad for everyone around him. He looked handsome. He always looked handsome. It was one of life's great injustices that people who behaved terribly were frequently very attractive, as if the universe were running an experiment on how much poor character the human I could forgive when paired with a strong jaw. I heard you tried to leave, he said. Several times, Jane agreed pleasantly. Something crossed his face, not guilt, because Derek's relationship with guilt was the relationship a fish has with a bicycle, but something adjacent to it. Discomfort, perhaps. The specific discomfort of a person who expected to be missed and is unsettled by the absence of begging. Jane. Derek, she said, in the same tone. The king is asking about you. He said it like an accusation. Like she had done something to arrange this. Like she had specifically chosen to become interesting to the most powerful wolf in the continent as a personal affront to him. Elder Cromwell is furious. Alpha Holt practically turned inside out when the royal advisor requested your file. My file, Jane repeated. My designation file. Yes. Jane considered this. Her designation file contained the following notable achievements: 2 failed trials, 1 partial pass on the herbalism assessment, and a note from the combat instructor that read, verbatim, shows unusual speed, lacks appropriate aggression. Does not appear to understand that training is not optional. It was not, by any measurable standard, the file of someone who should be attracting royal interest. She said. That's all you have to say? What would you like me to say, Derek? He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. He had the expression of a man who had rehearsed a conversation and arrived to find the other person had entirely different lines. I just think you should be careful, he said finally. Men like the Alpha King don't notice women like you for good reasons. Men like the Alpha King. Women like you. Jane picked up her herb basket. Thank you for that, she said. Truly. The insight has been invaluable. She walked away before he could see the way her jaw tightened, the small, private earthquake that moved through her every time someone defined her by what she wasn't. An omega. A failed wolf. A woman like you. She was halfway to the healer's tent when she felt it again. Eyes on her back. Not Derek's eyes. She knew those, flat and assessing and always measuring angles of usefulness. These were different. Heavy in the way that weather is heavy before a storm breaks. She didn't turn around. She had learned, over the last 3 days, that turning around showed nothing. Only the tree lean. Only shadow. Only the distant, silver ghost of someone watching her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't yet admitted he was asking. That night, she sat in the healer's cottage with old Marin, who was 81 years old, completely blind in one eye, and the single most informed person in Irevale. The king asked for my designation file, Jane said, grinding dried valerian root with rather more force than necessary. Marin didn't look up from her sewing. Did he? Elder Cromwell looked like he was going to spontaneously combust. He has that look most days. Marin. Jane set down the pestle. Why would the Alpha King want to know about an Omega who failed her trials twice and has no rank worth mentioning? Marin was quiet for long enough that the fire popped twice and a moth sacrificed itself gloriously against the lantern glass. Do you know, Marin said finally, that there are wolves born with a scent no designation trial can measure? Not strength. Not rank. Something older. She bit a thread with her remaining good teeth. Something the old texts called Lunara. The moon marked. Jane stared at her. That's a children's story. So is the one about the Alpha King being unmovable. Marin glanced up, her good eye sharp as a pin. And yet, here we are. Jane looked down at her hands, stained with herb work, rough at the knuckles, entirely ordinary. The hands of the lowest-ranked wolf in Irevale. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the cottage window, she could feel the weight of silver eyes. She ground the valerian to dust. Chapter 2. The King Who Did Not Explain Himself. Yoravos had built his reputation on 3 things: decisive action, absolute silence, and the ability to walk into any room and make every dominant wolf in it instinctively reconsider their life choices. He had never, in 15 years of ruling the 7 territories, requested the designation file of an Omega kitchen worker. His royal advisor, Cassius, a lean, silver-haired wolf who had survived 4 different political crises and 1 assassination attempt through the singular power of being the most organized person alive, held the file now with both hands and the expression of a man being asked to perform surgery with a soup spoon. "Her name is Jane Mercer," Cassius said, reading carefully. Age 22. Omega designation. Failed the physical trials twice. Partial pass on herbalism. Combat instructor noted she has, he paused, unusual speed. "I know what it says," Yora said. "Then may I ask what?" "No." Cassius closed his mouth. This was not unusual. Half his job was closing his mouth at precisely the right moment, and over 15 years he had achieved something approaching artistry. He set the file on the table and folded his hands. Yora stood at the window of the guest quarters, the largest room in Alpha Holt's hall, which still managed to feel slightly cramped around him, the way all spaces did. He was watching the herb garden below. There was nobody in it. He had not slept in 2 nights. This was also unusual. Yora Voss slept the way mountains rested, deeply, completely, entirely unbothered by the world. His wolf was old-blooded and sovereign, the direct descendant of the first Alpha, carrying a lineage that predated the 7 territories by 3 centuries. It did not get restless. It did not fixate. It did not pace the back of his skull like a caged thing at 3 a.m. because of the scent of a girl who had apologized for spilling broth on the tribute procession path. And yet, it was not a normal scent. He had processed this fact with the same methodical calm he applied to military intelligence: observe, analyze, conclude. The scent was layered in a way that defied simple classification. Beneath the herbs and the pine forest undercurrent and the warm-skin signature of her wolf, there was something else, something ancient and resonant that hit the deep brain part of him the way a tuning fork hits a wine glass. Not loud, not aggressive, simply matching. A frequency so precise it was almost violent in its accuracy. His wolf had one word for it: mine. Yora had, internally, a great deal to say about that. His wolf could form opinions all it liked from the primordial soup of its instincts. His wolf was not the one who ran 7 territories, negotiated treaties between packs who had been trying to kill each other since before written records, and maintained a political balance so fragile that one wrong alliance could crack the continent in half. His wolf did not get a vote. His wolf was, currently, not listening to any of this. "There is a prophecy," Yora said. Cassius went very still. "I know you know about it," Yora continued. "You've known since I was crowned. You've been carrying it in that meticulous brain of yours like a stone in a pocket, waiting to see if it would become relevant." He turned from the window. "It's become relevant." Cassius exhaled slowly. "The Lunara prophecy. Tell me the exact wording." "My king." "Exact wording, Cassius." The advisor straightened. When he spoke, his voice carried the particular weight of someone reciting something they had memorized long ago and hoped never to use. "When the last wolf is cast down and rejected by her own blood, she shall carry the moon's mark unseen. The king whose line holds the first throne will know her by scent alone. By her hand, the broken packs shall be made whole. By his protection, she shall be crowned. And any hand raised against the moon mark shall be the hand that ends its own pack." The room was very quiet. "Rejected by her own blood," Yora repeated. "Her promised mate rejected her 3 days ago. The file notes it." Cassius paused. "The timing of your arrival was not coincidence." "I know." Yora turned back to the window. "The Greymore and Ashvale packs know about the prophecy." Cassius' spine went rigid. "That's why the tribute review was requested. They're not here to pay tribute. They're here to assess whether I've found her." "Yes." A pause. "They've been intercepting the old texts. They've known for at least a year that the moon marked would be an Omega in one of 3 territories. If they identify her before I can establish protection, they'll kill her," Cassius said quietly. "Because if the prophecy completes, the moon-marked Luna legitimizes your line beyond any political challenge. No pack could move against the throne. Greymore and Ashvale have spent 20 years building toward a coup." He stopped. So the girl in the herb garden is not to be touched, Yora said. His voice was very quiet. That particular quiet that his guard had learned, over years, to treat as a louder warning than shouting. By anyone. For any reason. Cassius looked at his king for a long moment, at the rigid line of his shoulders and the silver of his eyes, which had not fully settled since the first morning, and made a decision to ask the question he already knew the answer to. Is it only political, Yora? Yora did not answer. Which was, for a man who built his reputation on decisive action, an answer in itself. Jane was in the herb garden when the shadow fell across the stone wall beside her. She knew before she turned. The weight of it was distinctive by now. 5 days of peripheral awareness had calibrated her to it the way long sea voyages calibrate sailors to the motion of water. She turned, garden trowel in hand, and found the Alpha King standing at the garden gate. In daylight, without the political theater of the procession and the assembled pack and the formal uniform of tribute protocol, she searched for a word that was accurate without being embarrassing, a great deal. That was the most clinical assessment she could manage. He was a great deal of person in a relatively finite garden. He was wearing a dark traveling coat, no crown insignia. Like he'd simply walked over. Like kings did that. You're not supposed to be in the herb garden, Jane said, because her brain was apparently committed to this approach. There's a tribute reception in the East Hall. I'm aware. You're missing it. Also aware. She looked at him. He looked at her. A gardening metaphor occurred to her. He had the quality of a tree in a storm. Everything around him moved, and he simply did not. What do you want? She asked. Something moved in his expression, the briefest fracture, there and gone. You tried to leave again this morning. I was under the impression I was a free citizen of the 7 territories, she said. Which you, technically, govern. So if I'm being detained, I'd like the paperwork. A pause. Then, she almost missed it. The very corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. More like a smile shadow. The proof that smiles had once occurred and left traces. You're not detained, he said. Then what am I? He looked at her for a long moment. The silver eyes tracked over her face with that same focused, furious confusion she had first seen in the procession, like she was a cipher he was determined to solve and deeply annoyed that he hadn't yet. Protected, he said finally. Jane stared at him. From what? He held her gaze. When I know the full answer to that, I'll tell you. He left before she could respond. She stood in the garden holding her trowel, watching him disappear back toward the hall, and had the distinct, unsettling sensation of standing at the edge of a very deep pool and realizing she had already stepped off. Old Marin's words came back to her. Something the old texts called Lunara. The moon marked. Jane looked down at her completely ordinary, herb-stained hands. Oh no, she thought. Chapter 3. What the Greymore pack came for. The Greymore Alpha's name was Baldric, and he had one of those faces that looked permanently smug even in moments of complete neutrality. The architectural achievement of a man who had spent 40 years getting everything he wanted and had allowed it to rearrange his bone structure accordingly. He arrived for the tribute dinner in full ceremonial dress, flanked by 6 of his senior wolves, and proceeded to spend the first hour performing the political equivalent of a man slowly circling a room he intends to rob. He complimented Alpha Holtz Hall. He made several expansive remarks about territorial prosperity. He directed 3 separate toasts at Yora with the specific enthusiasm of someone who needed the target to stay relaxed. Yora ate his food and watched Baldric with the expression of a chess player who has already seen 17 moves ahead and is waiting with great patience for his opponent to catch up. Jane was not at the dinner. Omegas did not attend tribute dinners. Omegas brought the food, maintained the fire, refreshed the water jugs, and otherwise occupied a carefully designed category of present but invisible furniture with pulses. Jane had long ago made her peace with this, in the same resigned way one makes peace with chronic weather. It was simply the architecture of her world. She was carrying a tray of spiced wine from the kitchen corridor when she heard her name. Not spoken aloud. Spelled letter by careful letter in the low, precise murmur of 2 men who believed the stone corridor was empty. She stopped. Her wolf, small and Omega quiet, had at least the gift of stillness. She pressed against the wall. Mercer girl. Omega designation, no rank. The voice was unfamiliar. Graymore accent, the flat vowels, the clipped consonants. Our tracker confirmed the scent profile 3 days ago. It matches the Lunara markers within acceptable variance. Acceptable variance is not confirmation. A second voice. Older. Careful. It's confirmation enough. The king has been watching her. He hasn't touched her yet, which means the bond hasn't completed. If we move before completion, the prophecy only protects her once the bond is sealed, the older voice confirmed. Before that, she's simply an Omega. Simply an Omega, the first voice agreed. The satisfaction in it was the specific warmth of someone lighting a match. The reception ends at midnight. The king will be occupied with Holt's formal tribute signing until dawn. We have a window. A pause. Then, make it clean. And nowhere near the hall. The king's guard have the east perimeter, take her through the northern wood. The footsteps moved away. Jane stood in the corridor for 3 full seconds, which was approximately how long it took for the information to travel from her ears through her brain and into her legs. Then she ran. She did not run to Alpha Holt. She had done the rapid calculation. Holt was in the dinner, politically paralyzed by the presence of 2 powerful packs and a king, and constitutionally incapable of doing anything that might create friction before the tribute was signed. She did not run to the Ironvale Guard. Ironvale's guard, bless their hearts, were good at ceremonial standing and poor at anything requiring improvisation. She ran to the one person she had direct evidence was paying attention. The royal guard stationed outside the east corridor recognized her. She could see it in the slight widening of his eyes. The Omega, the one the king, I need to speak with the advisor. Cassius. Now. She was breathing hard, but her voice was steady, which she considered a personal triumph given that people had just calmly discussed killing her as a logistical matter. It's about the Graymore delegation and a window that closes at midnight. The guard moved very quickly after that. Cassius listened to her account with his hands folded and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who was experiencing significant internal alarm and refusing to show it. When she finished, he asked 2 clarifying questions, the names of neither voice, which she couldn't provide, and the specific phrasing about the scent confirmation and Lunara markers, which she repeated word for word. He was quiet for a moment. How do you know about the Lunara prophecy? He asked. I don't really. Marin mentioned it. I didn't think it was real. She paused. Is it real? Another pause, the kind that contains an entire decision. Sit down, Jane, Cassius said. I'd rather stand. I'd rather you sat, because what I'm about to tell you is going to be a great deal to process and chairs exist for exactly this circumstance. She sat. He told her. Not everything. She could feel the edges of what he was leaving out, the places where his careful phrasing softened corners, but enough. The Lunara prophecy. The moon marked. The scent signature that matched no designation in the standard hierarchy because it wasn't a designation at all. It was a mark written into the oldest bloodline of the wolf world, skipping generations. Appearing only when the political balance of the territories reached its most critical point. Carried always, according to every recorded instance, by the least expected wolf. When the last wolf is cast down and rejected by her own blood. Rejected, Jane said. Yes. As in my failed mate bond with Derek. Yes. She absorbed this. Then, so Derek rejecting me was, what, cosmically necessary? Cassius had the decency to look slightly pained. The prophecy doesn't specify mechanism. Only outcome. That's deeply unsatisfying. Most prophecies are. He leaned forward. Jane, what matters right now is that Graymore knows. They intend to act tonight. I need to tell the king. He already knows, said a voice from the doorway. Yora stood in the frame. He was still in his tribute dinner coat, which meant he had left the formal signing early, an act of political rupture that would have consequences she couldn't yet calculate. His eyes went to Jane first. Then to Cassius. Then back to Jane, and something in them settled in the way a drawn weapon settles when it finds its target. You came to Cassius instead of trying to run, he said. I considered running, Jane said. But they mentioned the northern wood specifically, and that's my best exit route, so. The corner of his mouth did the thing again. The shadow smile. Practical. I try. He crossed the room in 4 strides and stopped in front of her with that particular stillness, the mountain in a storm quality that she was, against every sensible instinct, beginning to find less unsettling and more steadying. They won't move until the signing ends. That gives us 2 hours. His eyes held hers. I need you to trust me. Jane looked up at the alpha king of the 7 territories, the apex of apexes, who was asking her, a twice-veiled omega with herb stains on her hands, for trust. She thought about Derek's voice. You're omega. She thought about her mother's face at the 2nd failed trial. She thought about 400 carved sayings about wolves without strength. She thought about Marin's 1 sharp eye and the word moo-marked spoken into firelight. You've been watching me for 5 days without explaining why, she said. Yes. And you're not going to fully explain now either. I will explain everything, he said. After. After what? After I keep you alive. Jane considered this. It was not a perfect answer. It was not even a particularly good answer by conventional standards of transparency and communication. But it was delivered without pretense or performance, in the flat, direct tone of a man who had said exactly what he meant and was waiting, simply, to see if it was enough. She had spent 6 years with a man who dressed every truth in decoration. Plain felt, unexpectedly, like relief. Fine, she said. But I want the full explanation after. Full. No Cassius-edited corners. Cassius, to his credit, looked only mildly offended. Agreed, Yora said. He turned to his guard and began giving orders, and Jane sat in the chair she had been told to sit in and watched the machinery of royal protection assemble around her and thought, with the slightly unhinged clarity of a person whose life had just fundamentally changed direction. I still haven't unpacked my bag. Chapter 4. Blood in the Courtyard. The attack did not come at midnight. It came at 11:43, which was deeply inconsiderate and also, Jane would later reflect, entirely on brand for people who had been planning an assassination as a scheduling item. They came from the north, as the voice in the corridor had promised, 12 wolves in shifted form, more gray and fast, moving through the outer edge of the tribute grounds with the organized silence of a pack that had drilled this specific entry pattern many times. The Ashvale delegation, it turned out, had sent 4 of their own through the eastern wall simultaneously, which demonstrated a level of interpack cooperation that would have been genuinely admirable under literally any other circumstances. Yora's guard met the Greymore wolves at the tree line. What happened there was brief and extremely decisive, and not in Greymore's favor. Royal Guard were not ceremonial wolves. They were selected from the top combat ranks of all 7 territories, trained under a regimen that other packs discussed in the same hushed tones normally reserved for natural disasters, and they had the specific advantage of having been expecting this. 6 against 12 became 6 against 9 very quickly, and then 6 against 6, and the remaining 6 made the reasonable decision to retreat into the forest and reconsider their career trajectory. Jane knew none of this in real time. Jane was in the inner courtyard with Cassius, 2 guard, and the instruction to stay near the wall and do not move, which she was following with complete sincerity right up until the moment a Greymore wolf came over the south wall. The one that everyone had apparently agreed to leave unguarded, in the way that critical security gaps always seem obvious after the fact, and landed in the courtyard 12 feet away. It was large. Most shifted wolves were large by the standards of the non-shifted world, but this one had the additional quality of being specifically focused on her, which made it seem larger in the subjective geometry of personal threat. It moved toward her with the low, deliberate pace of something that didn't expect resistance. The guard to her left moved to intercept. The guard to her right moved to intercept. The Greymore wolf was faster than both, not stronger, but faster, and it feinted left before cutting right with a fluidity that was honestly impressive and extremely inconvenient, and Jane had approximately 1.5 seconds to make a decision. She made the decision her body had apparently been building toward for 22 years of being underestimated. She ran. Not away. toward angling wide of the wolf's fixed gaze, using the half-second of its target recalibration, moving along the wall with that annoying speed, the speed that made opponents feel embarrassed rather than defeated. She put the central courtyard well between herself and it, scooped up the only thing near her hands, an iron torch bracket pulled loose from its crumbling stone mount, which was less weapon and more evidence of deferred maintenance, and positioned herself with the wall at her back. The wolf paused. In her years of kitchen duty and herb work and invisible labor, Jane had learned one thing about predators. The moment of pause was an opportunity. She had 3 seconds before it resumed. She used them to identify the angle, the weight distribution, the slight favoring of the left rear leg that suggested an old injury. She would like to be very clear, in retrospect, that she did not plan what happened next. The Greymoor wolf lunged. Jane stepped left, which was the direction of the bad leg, and swung the bracket horizontally at shoulder height, which connected with a resonance that vibrated up her arms and rearranged her understanding of physics. The wolf hit the courtyard stones. She stepped back. Her heart was doing something architectural and complicated in her chest. The 2 guards stared at her. "I've never done that before," she told them, which seemed important to clarify. Then the arrow came from the north. She saw it in fragmented time, the way catastrophic moments always arrive, in slices, in separate images that the brain can only assemble into sequence afterward. The guard to her left. The arrow. The sound, which she had never heard before and immediately understood she would never forget. The guard going down. And then Yora was in the courtyard. She did not see him arrive. He was simply there, the way he was always simply there, materialized between one breath and the next, placing himself in the space between Jane and the angle of fire with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply enacting it. The second arrow was already in the air. It caught him across the forearm, the glancing slice of a trajectory deflected by movement rather than intercepted cleanly. He didn't flinch. His blood hit the courtyard stones in a pattern her herbalist brain registered, not arterial, not deep, but vivid against the pale granite. The silver of his eyes was full wolf, entirely gone to the old blood. Across the courtyard, the east gate splintered inward. The Ashvale wolves. 4 of them, fully shifted, pouring through the gap with the confidence of a pack that had expected less resistance and was already recalculating. They stopped when they saw Yora. Not because of the guard were moving to intercept, drawing positions across the courtyard. They stopped because of him. The specific quality of a wolf so far up the dominance hierarchy that even shifted instincts registered it as something pre-rational, something you didn't choose to recognize so much as simply found yourself recognizing. The Ashvale wolves looked at the Alpha King, with his blood dripping and his eyes shifted and the single still point of his body between them and the Omega behind him, and the foremost wolf made a sound, not aggression, not a challenge. Something lower. Something involuntary. Reconsideration. Valdric came through the east gate last. Still human, which was the tell, the alpha who sends his wolves first stays human because he intends to negotiate if the military option collapses. He took in the courtyard. His wolves halted, 2 Greymoor wolves down, the guard in formation, Jane alive and standing behind the king with an iron bracket in her hands. His smug architecture faltered. "Voss," he said. "This isn't what." "Your wolves," Yora said, in a voice that was so quiet it somehow occupied the entire courtyard, "are on their knees. Your treaty is forfeit under Article 9 of the Royal Compact. Your pack leadership is in dispute as of this moment by my authority, which you've just violated in 7 distinct ways." A pause. "Do you want me to continue, or is the situation sufficiently clear?" Valdric's jaw worked. The political machinery behind his eyes ran through its options at high speed and found them all, in sequence, closed. Behind Yora, Jane lowered the iron bracket. Her arms were shaking, not from fear, she thought, or not only from fear, but from the full-body expenditure of the last 4 minutes, which had involved more direct violence than her entire previous 22 years combined. She became aware that she had medicinal herbs in her hair. She had been grinding preparations before Cassius sent for her, and she hadn't thought to, it seemed. In this moment, both deeply irrelevant and somehow perfect. The most important thing happening in the 7 territories right now, and she was standing in the middle of it smelling of valerian and nettle. Yora's head turned slightly, not taking his eyes off Valdric, but his attention, that specific, focused, furious weight, shifted backward, toward her. Checking. She was fine. Or she would be, once her heart rate remembered its normal pace. "I'm all right," she said quietly. The line of his shoulders changed. Just slightly. The way a held breath releases. Valdric was taken into guard custody with the specific energy of a man who had played a complicated chess game and flipped the board, only to discover the other player had glued all the pieces down. Jane stood in the courtyard in the aftermath, the particular hollow of a moment after catastrophe, where the world recalibrates and finds itself slightly different than it was before, and looked at the blood on the stones and the guard being carried and the moon overhead and Yora, standing with his cut forearm, finally turning to face her fully. "You're bleeding on my herbs," she said. She watched him look down at his arm, then at the scattering of dried herbs that had fallen from her hair during the chaos, now reddening at the edges from the slow drip of his wound. The shadow smile came back. This time, it reached his eyes. "So I am," he said. Chapter 5. The prophecy completes. They sat in the healer's cottage, Yora Voss, Alpha King of the 7 territories, on a 3-legged stool that was structurally skeptical of his presence, and Jane Mercer, Omega, on the floor with her legs crossed and her back against the wall, cleaning and binding the cut on his forearm with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times for people who mattered far less. Old Marin sat in the corner pretending to sleep. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the guard were managing the aftermath of what Cassius was already calling, in the clipped, weary tones of a man composing a formal report at midnight, the tributary incident. Yora watched Jane work. He had a specific expression for this. She had catalogued it over 5 days without meaning to, the way you learn by proximity the patterns of weather. It was the expression of a man who had controlled everything in his world for so long that encountering something he couldn't control had become the most compelling experience available to him. He wore it like a soldier wears a wound he doesn't entirely regret. "The full explanation," Jane said, without looking up from the bandaging. "You promised." "I did. Start with the prophecy." Cassius gave me the edited version. A pause. Then he recited it, the full text, uncut, with the weight of something carried a long time finally being set down. "When the last wolf is cast down and rejected by her own blood, she shall carry the moon's mark unseen. The king whose line holds the first throne will know her by scent alone." Jane kept her hands moving. "Steady. And you knew, when I spilled the broth." "I knew something." A careful distinction. "My wolf knew more than I was willing to accept immediately." "How long did it take you to accept it?" "Approximately until you turned around and told me you'd clean it up." She glanced up. He was looking at her with that furious, focused attention, and something underneath it now not softened, exactly. Yora Voss was not a man who softened, but opened, the way a window opens, the structure unchanged, but something moving through. "You've been alone with this for how long?" she asked. "The prophecy came to me the day I was crowned." 15 years. 15 years of knowing you'd recognize the moon marked by scent, and then one day you walk into a tribute procession and a woman apologizes for spilling broth on you. "Yes." Jane secured the bandage. "How anticlimactic for you." The sound that came from him was unexpected, quiet, but genuine. A laugh. Not the shadow of one, not the architectural trace of past amusement, but the actual thing, brief and unguarded, and it rearranged his face entirely. In the corner, Marin cracked one eye open, registered what she was seeing, and closed it again with the satisfaction of someone watching a very slow chess game finally reach its predicted conclusion. "It was," Yora agreed. Jane sat back. "The bond," she said. Cassius mentioned, before the bond completes, the prophecy's protection doesn't apply. That's why Greymoor moved when they did. "Yes." "So," she looked at her hands. "What does bond completion actually?" "It requires choice," he said. "From both sides. An acknowledged claim." A pause. "It's not what you're perhaps imagining." "It's not." I know what a mate bond is, she said. Drilly. I was promised to someone for 6 years. The air in the room changed slightly. Vance, Yura said. The name in his mouth had the quality of something he had considered carefully and had not yet decided how to process. I know what he did. Everyone knows what he did. It was Tuesday. She picked up the herb remnants from the floor beside her, the ones from her hair, still stained at the edges with his blood, and held them for a moment. Derek decided I wasn't worth the bloodline cost. And apparently the universe decided that was the qualifying event for a 3,000-year-old prophecy. She looked up. There's a certain irony there that I think I'll be processing for some time. The rejection didn't break you, Yura said. Matter of fact. Observational. It tried, she said. Equally matter of fact. I had good containers. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who never moved without intention, he reached out and took the herb and blood remnant from her fingers, not the herbs, but her hand itself, briefly, the warm pressure of his palm against her knuckles. The contact lasted 3 seconds. It was, by every measurable standard, a small thing. Every nerve in Jane's body disagreed with that assessment. Something moved through her, not the sharp, sudden strike of it she might have expected, but something more like recognition. The deep brain, pre-irrational variety. The same frequency Yura had described, hit from the other side. Matching. Her wolf, small and omega quiet and 22 years of being ranked last, lifted its head. He felt it too. She could tell because his eyes closed for just a moment, the involuntary response of someone receiving a force they'd been anticipating for 15 years and finding it, somehow, still larger than the anticipation. I need to tell you something, he said. His hand was still around hers. Before you decide anything. So that it's fully informed. All right. Ruling 7 territories is not a comfortable life. It is not a life that involves herb gardens and quiet mornings. A pause. The political consequences of what happened tonight are significant. Greymore and Ashvale will face tribunal. 3 other packs have been watching this situation and will need to be managed. If the bond completes and you take the Luna title. I failed my designation trials, Jane said. Twice. I know. I read the file. My combat instructor said I lack appropriate aggression. You knocked a shifted Greymore wolf onto the courtyard stones with an iron bracket tonight. I maintain that was a surprise to me as much as anyone. Your herbalism partial pass. I should have passed fully. The examiner had a personal issue with omegas in medical practice. She stopped. How do you know about my herbalism score? I read the file very carefully. Jane stared at him. When? The first night. She let that sit for a moment. The Alpha King of the 7 territories, reading her designation file on the first night. The file with the combat instructor's note about aggression and the failed trials and the partial pass. Reading it, she suspected, not to find weakness, but to find everything that the ranking system had decided not to count. Your turn, Yura said. Tell me something. What do you want to know? Why did you stay? After the guard stopped you on the road. You could have pushed past him. He wasn't authorized to physically restrain you. You knew your rights. You recited pack law at Cassius before he'd even invited you to sit down. Jane considered this. The honest answer lived underneath the practical one, and she had spent a long time keeping the honest answers below the surface where they couldn't be used against her. But Yura had just told her 15 years of solitary prophecy and the genuine laugh, and the 15 ways he'd read her file, and he was sitting on a structurally skeptical stool in a healer's cottage at midnight letting her wrap his arm. And there was something about all of it that made the practical answer feel insufficient. Because, she said slowly, for 5 days something was paying attention to me. Not to what rank I was. Not to what I'd failed. Just me. Whatever I actually was. She looked at the fire. I've wanted to leave Ironvale for years. But I wanted to leave because there was nothing left to stay for. And then something changed, and I didn't know what it was, and I wanted to find out before I left. She paused. That's a very vulnerable answer. Yes, he said. You could use it against me. I won't. She believed him. Which was the most remarkable part, not the prophecy. Not the courtyard, not the 15 years or the silver eyes or the weight of royal attention. Simply that she believed him, the way you believe the ground when you step on it, not because you've tested every inch, but because something in the body knows. She turned her hand over in his and held it properly. The fire popped. In the corner, Marin made a sound that she would later claim was a snore, and that nobody believed for a moment. The bond, Jane said. How does it work, practically? The acknowledgement. I spoke and claim. Witnessed. Before the moon sets. His thumb moved once across her knuckles. Freely given. And then I'm the Luna of the 7 territories. If you choose it. And the prophecy completes, and Greymore and Ashvale lose their political leverage, and 3 other packs reassess their positions. Yes. And you get a Luna who failed her trials twice and smells of nettle. And knocked a shifted wolf unconscious with architectural salvage, he said. The shadow smile was back, and this time it had nowhere left to hide. I find I'm not troubled by the rest. Jane looked at him, really looked, the way she'd been careful not to for 5 days, because careful not to was the armor she wore, and she hadn't been ready to take it off. She looked at the silver eyes, and the 15 years they'd carried alone, and the laugh she'd heard once, and the blood she'd cleaned, and the way he'd placed himself between her and the arrow without hesitation or calculation, the way water runs downhill, not because it decides to, but because that is simply what it does. Yora, she said. His name, directly, for the first time. Something shifted in his face. Small. Seismic. Ask me properly, she said. He stood from the 3-legged stool, which survived the event but would spend the remainder of its service life with a slight additional lean, and faced her in the firelight. The Alpha King. The Apex. The wolf who had ruled 7 territories for 15 years with absolute authority and never looked confused until a woman with a ceramic pot had stumbled into his procession. He was, Jane noted, slightly nervous. She found this wonderful. Jane Mercer, he said. Omega of Ironvale. The wolf my wolf has been looking for since before I understood what it was looking for. A pause. Will you let me claim you? Freely and with full knowledge of everything I've told you. As my equal, my Luna, and the only person in 3 centuries to tell me I was bleeding on their herbs. In the corner, Marin had fully abandoned the pretense of sleep. Jane looked at the man in front of her in perfect, private, 15 years of carrying something alone that she was now being asked to share, and thought of Derek's voice on a Tuesday. You're Omega. She was. She was also, apparently, the moon-marked. The woman of prophecy had been waiting for. The last wolf who would be cast down and rise to be the undoing, not of a king, but of everything that had tried to keep her small. Yes, she said. The fire burned. The moon, which had watched this particular story for 3,000 years while it waited for the right Tuesday and the right 2 people to finally find their way to a healer's cottage with herbs in their hair and blood on the bandages, held still for just a moment. Then it moved on, satisfied. Marin picked up her sewing. Took long enough, she said, to no one in particular. Outside the cottage, Derek Vance was standing in the courtyard receiving the news that the Omega he had rejected had just been claimed as Luna of the 7 territories. He stood there for a very long time. Then he went inside and sat down. He did not sit down on a 3-legged stool, because some metaphors are too generous. He sat on the floor. And,